Thank you, President Andre, and good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. The bike riding has really been for my benefit, and she's a great person to ride with. But first, I need to thank the Denver Post for highlighting our important subject today. If any of you missed it, above the fold, water divides the state, and it is the issue. And after that, I have a question for you. Is there anything fundamentally more important to the past, present, or future of Denver and the entire Front Range than water? And I would guess not. Without the proper stewardship of this valuable resource, we wouldn't be anything like the thriving metropolis that we see Denver as today. And so today, we're privileged to have one of the most preeminent authorities on water issues in the country speak to us. For 40 years, Justice Hobbs has studied, written, and lectured about water issues. For almost 20 years, he led the Colorado Supreme Court in its deliberations and decisions on water law. And what happens to water in Colorado affects the people in a dozen more states. Highly critical. Just how much Greg's knowledge is valued can be measured by the evidence of someone paying $300,000 for his writings. Unfortunately for him, the payment was to one of our Western Slope politicians. But that's another story, and you can see me on that one later if you don't know the story. You probably read about Greg in our keynote, in our keyway, but he is educated at Notre Dame, Columbia University, and law school at Cal Berkeley, and he has spent time in the Peace Corps in Colombia, worked for the EPA, and many years in private practice law here in Denver. So it's truly a pleasure to introduce my friend, Justice Greg Hobbs.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm really pleased to be here today. And I'll tell you what, citizens of Colorado, thanks for retaining me in office twice. We have the merit selection system. As you know, in Colorado, we're totally removed from politics. It's a great privilege to serve, not think about politics when you have to do something as important as a water decision. Now, water may divide us, but it also unites us as Coloradans, and that's really what I want to talk about today. So you see here on your tables two guides of the Colorado Foundation for Water Education, the Water Heritage Guide and the Environmental Era Guide. So the Water Heritage Guide goes from about 1859 to 1964. That was the time when we were developing water projects, our water law, and trying to make sure we had compacts with other states. As this map shows, 18 downstream states and the Republic of Mexico at the Rio Grande and Colorado River depend upon snowmelt coming off the Continental Divide, East Slope and West Slope. So just keep in mind, as a statistical average, we in Colorado can only consume about 1/3 of the water that Colorado produces. 2/3 has to go out of state because the law of the United States, of which we are a part, requires the equitable sharing of water between upstream states and downstream states that share an interstate stream. If you can't reach a compact or an agreement with the other states that share your stream, then the U.S. Supreme Court will do it for you. Our great compact negotiator, Delph Carpenter, a first-generation resident of the Union Colony, which we now know as Greeley, at the confluence of the Platte and Cherry Creek, was our mastermind. He served in the Colorado Senate from 1909 to 1911 when he was voted out by a party shift. In a bipartisan way, his colleagues turned to him and said, okay, you do the litigation against Kansas. Kansas was suing Colorado in the U.S. Supreme Court, and figure us a way for our perpetual future to get a water allotment that we could depend upon. So Delph Carpenter was the architect of the Water Compact. Compacts, a clause in the United States Constitution, allows states to enter treaties with each other, and then with the blessing of Congress, they become federal law as well as state law. So compacts have been used in the East where rivers were the borders between the original colonies and the emerging states in the well-watered part of the country. But you know what rivers do? They shift. So you didn't know what taxing or congressional district you might be in. So those eastern states then made compacts among themselves about what their boundaries would be. And so Delph Carpenter decided to take this idea. This is a Coloradan. Let's take this constitutional principle and negotiate with the other states and decide what water we can use for our future. So in 1964, the Wilderness Act is passed, and we have the Environmental Era. That's the second guide you have, coming along with the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Federal Land Management Act, which applies to the 8 million acres of Bureau of Land Management land in Colorado, the Forest Planning Act that applies to the 14 million acres of forest lands in Colorado. Remember, 1/3 of our land in Colorado still is retained by the federal government. The other 2/3 was disposed of to the settlers of the West through the Homestead Act of 1862 and through various township settlements like the Fountain Colony, which became Colorado Springs, the Chicago Colony that became Longmont, and the Union Colony that became Greeley. So the settlers were moving west. They needed a water supply. They built direct flow ditches into the Arkansas and the South Platte to deliver water to farms, because it was rumored that the miners, the 1859ers who came out here after the gold strike at the Platte and Cherry Creek and the Pikes Peak gold field, it was rumored they liked to eat. So the farmers came on the heels of the miners, and our water law actually grew out of the farming experience, because the water in the mountains used in the sluice boxes and hydraulic mining went right back to the streams. But when it bursts out on the plains, then these direct flow ditches followed by the reservoirs would capture and store and use the water, spread the stream out onto the lands that could be irrigated. And our great and growing cities of the 20th century and into the 21st century have grown directly out of our farmland. That's our heritage and culture. And we have 7 water courts in Colorado that adjudicate the water rights of anybody in Colorado who claims a water use. This is a settlement at Mesa Verde. This is the Farview Village on Chapin Mesa. I want you to look at that petroglyph, that carving in the front of it. That is a symbol of a spring, the water coming out of the earth, the people settling on the earth and migrating into 360 directions. That's a kiva there where the people could live during the winter. There's an air shaft. You've seen these before. In Mesa Verde, there's a deflector stone down in the kiva to circulate the air. The smoke went up through a smoke hole that had a ladder for you to get down into it. But this is the most remarkable thing. There have been 4 reservoirs discovered at Mesa Verde that operated between 780 and 1276 AD when the ancestral Puebloans migrated in the 3rd Great Drought out of southwestern Colorado. The archaeologists used to think this was a dance platform, because the Native Americans always celebrated when they planted, when they harvested, and particularly when they had food in the winter. This was not a dance platform. It was a sedimented-in reservoir. And it's very ingenious because this reservoir is on a mesa top. The water supply is stormwater, rainwater coming off the side slopes, which they would pat down with their feet, the clay soils, and conduct interceptor ditches to put this water supply, this precious water supply, into a reservoir that was only used for domestic water supply. It was so precious. Otherwise, you had to go to a spring to the north a mile or another spring to the south a mile and a half. So they needed to conserve in a smart way and govern around this scarce water resource to keep their population going for a long, long time until this devastating 3rd drought hit and they couldn't stay up anymore because their food supply disappeared. Downtown Denver, Cherry Creek. Look what has happened to this waterway that was a trash way. In 1972, remember, car bodies rusted. All our industrial dump was the South Platte River. You know that. You remember that? One of the great acts, the Clean Water Act of 1972 and its counterpart State Act, became the cleanup of these rivers so that we could then build up our settlements along these streams, these rivers, bikeways, pathways, condominium residential development that didn't exist before. All these goods that are, and I say good in a positive way, that our fellow citizens love and want because we love the landscape of Colorado. And mostly, we love to hear the flowing streams. And our recreational economy has grown out of this farming and urban economy. Look at this, a red-winged blackbird at Washington Park. Don't we gather around any pool we can find? Don't the wildlife gather too that we see and our children and our grandchildren admire and love to spot? And this is the Fremont map of 1845. Fremont came up the North Platte, you know, and found the way to South Pass, which is the break in the divide where the Transcontinental Railroad went through in 1862. But see how on the front range there, it's the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, and the Comanche and Kiowa who own and possess the land. So Fremont was an Army officer, and he was exploring this country, but we must remember the Native Americans were here before us, and we occupied and entered into their territory. That's part of our heritage. We should acknowledge that. We still have the Ute, Mountain Ute, and the Southern Ute tribes with us today in Colorado due to a reservation of 1868 after the Civil War. Unfortunately, however, we removed the rest of our native population so we could do what we wanted to do with the land. Governor Hickenlooper, December 3rd, 2014, acknowledged and apologized to the Cheyenne and the Arapaho for the massacre of 200 people at Sand Creek who were flying an American flag and a white flag of peace. We need to acknowledge our history and teach our children and grandchildren about this. Abraham Lincoln. We were formed as a territory at the outset of the Civil War, February of 1861. What were we formed out of? Nebraska, Kansas, New Mexico, and Utah territory. We didn't exist as a jurisdiction until then. Why were we carved like this, in this trapezoidal fashion in 1861? Because the Continental Divide comes out of Wyoming, takes that bend by the Collegiate Peaks, goes to Silverton and Durango, doubles back to Wolf Creek Pass, and plunges into New Mexico. Gold had been discovered. Our first mission as Coloradans, hold the gold fields against the Texas Confederates, who then did try to invade. And our farmers and miners put down their pick shovels and sluice boxes and bagged the wagon train of the Confederates, killing every horse and mule, burning all the supplies, and sent the Texans walking back to Texas. Since that time, they bought back Crested Butte. Fair is fair. I want you to take a look at this map. I know you can't see it entirely, but this is the land office map. If you lived on a homestead for 5 years, then you could go in and claim the patent or title to the surface. But what about the water? In the 1866 Mining Act, Colorado severed the water from the land of the public domain and made the water supply available to the states and territories for the settlement of the water, for the creation of legal use interests. The public always owns the water, but you can get, as a town or an individual or a business, a private right or a public right if you're a town to use the public's water resource for beneficial use in order of priority, enforced in scarce times by the locking down by local water commissioners of headgates that are not in priority. So we take our water system very seriously. Here is the Colorado River upper basin and lower basin. The upper basin, we've got Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico. The lower basin, Arizona, Nevada, California. So the 1922 compact that Delph Carpenter negotiated in Bishop's Lodge in Santa Fe divides the waters between the upper basin and the lower basin. But to get this compact, we had to guarantee that 75 million acre-feet on a 10-year running average would pass the gauge at Lee Ferry below what is now Glen Canyon Dam. So we use Lake Powell to store in good water years for the scarce years the release of that water necessary to hold our bargain with the lower basin. And in these years of shortage, like this 15-year drought we've had, if we didn't have Lake Powell, we would have been high and dry years ago. Even though Powell and Meade are only half full, that means half empty, we've been able to abide by the compact. That's how important those reservoirs are. This is the water supply that Colorado has. These are statistical averages that show what goes out of state in an average year. You notice, I'm going to call them the puny plain streams, the Platte, the Arkansas, and the Rio Grande, all on the east slope. Our population, 85% on the east slope. 80% of our water supply arises on the west slope of Colorado, in these tributaries and streams that make up the Colorado River. And all these tributaries and streams come together into Lake Powell, into the main stem of the Colorado River. Notice that big bulge of water going out of the main stream of the Colorado River itself, but it's fed by the Gunnison and the Uncompahgre and the Dolores, that curious north-running river, the White and the Yampa. So this is what we have as Coloradans. We are the mother of rivers, but we can only consume a third of it. So whatever Mother Nature provides us, then whatever we have to deliver, we live on the rest of it. So we must practice smart water conservation. That includes storage, and it includes all the kinds of conservation measures we can employ to reduce our water usage. Now, in that 2002-2003 drought, citizens themselves reduced the water demand by at least 20%. At least 20%. By, not just mandatory rationing, but realizing that they needed to cut back on landscape watering and maybe put in xeriscape. The Denver Water Department was a leader in xeriscape vegetation. Even more conservation will be required for the future. This is a hydrograph. Again, it's the statistical average of flows, but notice that the hydrograph mirrors the Great Divide itself, right? From May to the end of June, the peak of the snowmelt. And then you might as well look at these other statistical averages and realize that often we're the patient on the table, right? The rest of the year is fairly dry, but interrupted by floods. That's what storage does. It captures the water supply, just like Joseph and the Pharaoh put grain in the granaries for the times of scarcity, for the days of want, from the times of plenty. That's what reservoirs do. They conserve, they extend the ability to manage the water that belongs to Colorado under its compacts. And so we have the 7 water divisions of the state of Colorado. Water Division 1, the South Platte. Water Division 2, the Arkansas. Water Division 3, the Rio Grande. Water Division 7, the San Juan, the Animas, the Dolores. Water Division 4, the Uncompahgre and the Gunnison. Water Division 5, the mainstream of the Colorado on the west slope to Utah border. Water Division 6, the Yampa White, and that piece of North Park there with the North Platte and the Laramie River, which goes out of Colorado and then comes back and joins the South Platte below McConaughey Dam in Nebraska. And each of these water divisions, a water judge, a division water engineer. What does the water judge do? Decree what the water rights are. Municipal, agricultural, in-stream flow. The Water Conservation Board holds in-stream flow rights. Kayak course rights. All of these are stacked as our values and customs changed on each other, going back to the senior to the junior. We have a market in water, however, where you can sell your senior right and transfer the historic consumptive use, which the crops consume typically, and move it to the environment or to cities. But you can only move the water you can consume because the return flows belong back to the stream, back to the public's water resource so that other people can use it. However, the trans-mountain diversions, moving from the west slope to the east slope, this is why they're so controversial, can be 100% consumptively used because they're introduced entirely from a different watershed. And therefore, the right of reuse and successive use attaches to the trans-mountain water. This is why the west slope is so concerned. They don't get return flows. Generally, agriculture consumes about 50% of the water supply applied to the fields. 50% goes back into the groundwater aquifers and through tailwater ditches back to the stream so that it's made available for other water uses and to fulfill the compact entitlements. So when you read on today's paper why the west slope is concerned about additional trans-mountain diversion, just remember it's always been that way. We have this built-in tension because you can 100% consumptively use water taken out of another basin. That's the most valuable there is. But a native water right you use only once, and then you have to return it to the stream. These are the Trans-Mountain diversions. There is a Trans-Mountain diversion guide published by the Water Foundation, yourwatercolorado.org. I'm Vice President, Chair of the Publications Committee, 38 Headwaters magazines, 10 citizen guides, which you can access through that website. The legislature set up this non-political, non-advocacy foundation in the midst of the 2002-2003 drought to reach out to Coloradans and teach them about our most precious resource, the stuff of life itself, the water resource. This is the Blue River between Lake Dillon and Green Mountain Reservoir. There we go. That's Lake Dillon. You know how dry that was in 2003. There was dust blowing off the bottom of the reservoir. Well, this happens to be a good water year. I believe this is 2011 in the midst of a great 15-year drought, and it got filled back up again. That's what reservoirs do. Catch, hold, retain, use, and deliver. Hay Ranch on the west slope. Now, some people think that's a wasteful application of water. They're growing mountain hay and alfalfa, but a lot of this return flow is going right back to the Colorado River through the aquifer, and these are the great open spaces. Do you remember when Governor Romer discovered smart growth? You know what smart growth was? Retaining agricultural production between the growing cities, between Boulder and Longmont and Fort Collins, for example, and the people have invested in open space, preserving the water on the land so that we can have parks and open space and trails, and then there are private conservation easements being bought up. This is levering GOCO money, the gambling money, with private money to preserve open spaces like this. So one of the great dilemmas of Colorado is, do we want to preserve this agricultural landscape, or are we going to dry it up to move it to the cities permanently? So there are tools in the toolkit the legislature has enacted. Dry year leases, where you can lease water from the farming ditches and reservoirs, but they retain the permanent rights, but they get the income from turning their water consumptive use over to the city portfolio. Or you can retire it to the Water Conservation Board or lease it for these in-stream flow purposes. We're trying to do it all. We love the rivers. There's my friend Mark Chalfant. He can't even stay in a ducky boat. Huh? This is below Grand Junction on Ruby Westwater. So we love these streams. We carry ourselves on them. The great blue heron fly over. There's Lake Powell with a bathtub ring. Why? Because we needed to make the water deliveries to the lower basin. This is the endangered fishes. They were warm water fishes. Lake Powell releases cold water. We're trying to keep these folks, these people, that's what the Indians thought they were, some form of living being, alive so that we don't exterminate them. So we've got endangered fish hatcheries. We're doing side pools with warmer water. We're trying to conserve them so we don't extinguish them. And the reason we do this is we want to develop further our compact entitlements, and we can't do that if we violate the Endangered Species Act. This is a complicated web of life. My brother Will Hobbs, the young adult author of Bearstone, Bear Dance, Downriver, River Thunder. A lot of your kids and grandkids have read his books. A writer out of Durango. There's the Lee Ferry Gauge. And below the Lee Ferry Gauge, where we love to launch for the Colorado River trips. If you haven't done it, it's a trip of a lifetime, along with a visit to Machu Picchu. There's my grandson, KJ, and me on the tube of a motorized raft, 6.5 days instead of 18 if you can't do the drift boat. This is in 2010. The Great Hoover Dam, the Lake Mead that stores the water delivered from Lake Powell for the lower basin, the dividing line with Mexico and the Delta. Under a pioneering agreement now, Mexico can store water in Lake Mead. They can store their share, 1,500,000 feet a year off the top of the Colorado River in Lake Mead, and last year they delivered some of their water down into the dry stream bed. That's the Morelos Dam that used to divert all the water. See that dry stream bed? This past year they passed a pulse flow into this dry stream bed, and Mexican families who hadn't seen the river for 25 years turned out and celebrated and splashed in the water. It was a very stirring moment. The dry Colorado River Delta, this is water shown or going in there from a saline water discharge from an Arizona water district that has kept this migratory bird sanctuary La Ciénaga alive. All right, so there's lots of things going on transboundary. We're talking with Mexico all the time, the 7 basin states and the United States. All over the Colorado River Plateau, you will see these handprints, these pictographs. What were the ancestral Pueblans telling us? Hello, goodbye, and good luck.
You still have the time for questions. Maybe 2 questions?
A couple. Andre says maybe a couple of questions. Yes.
Referred to in the Denver Post today about the Front Range cities, Aurora, Colorado Springs, and they seem to take the approach that the state owes diversion from the western slope to supply growth for the eastern slope. And what moral or political obligation do you think we have to provide water to?
The whole idea of the Colorado Water Plan, which is being developed that story talks about, is to try to get agreement rather than end up in court. As a judge, I will tell you that you don't want to hand over these water matters to the state or federal courts, especially the U.S. Supreme Court that really doesn't know about Western water too well. You want to try to reach a consensus. So I think what you're seeing is this concern. It's been traditional concern. The resolution of that concern is to develop joint projects that help both sides of the divide. So I think you're seeing some dig-in rhetoric towards the inevitable necessity of coming to agreement. One more question?
The canal, excuse me, the canal system, like the Highline Canal,
Yes.
is that present in other parts of the state or not?
Well, yeah, there are these agricultural canals all over the place that now go through urbanizing areas. The Highline Canal was built for crops, and the city grew around it. This is remarkable. And, of course, it's a treasure that people want to see some water in. But the water is actually owned by the Denver Water Department, and it's up to them how much water gets in that ditch. Okay? I think they'll work with their citizens because citizens happen to be voters.
We're going to take one more here.
One more.
I seem to recall that the aquifers in the Front Range were in danger. Could you speak to how much they contribute to our supply?
Okay, there's tributary groundwater aquifers, and that means that any water that can get to a service stream within 100 years is part of this prior appropriation doctrine. It's managed in a conjunctive use manner. Service rights, groundwater rights, the doctrine of prior appropriation applies first in time, first in right to the use of that resource. But the Denver Basin Aquifer itself contains 4 aquifers that are fossil groundwater stacked on top of each other. Douglas County grew 95% of its water supply originally on non-renewable groundwater. It is now trying to wean itself from that, save that deep groundwater which doesn't get replenished naturally for times of drought, and then make arrangements to recycle Trans Mountain water, work with Denver. There's South Metro area now is working on the WISE project, W-I-S-E, which tries to integrate conservation, reuse of Trans Mountain water, and smart water savings to take the pressure off of those deep aquifers. Thank you.
Don't go anywhere yet. Justice Hobbs, it's a shame that you are not passionate about this subject. We truly are privileged to have had you speak to us today. We have made a contribution to have 150 children inoculated against polio in your name.
Thank you.
So that's with help of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations. We thank you for being here. It was terrific. We would have listened to you for another 2 hours. Kudos to the program committee. It's the second time that we now have a speaker that speaks on the day that the headline is in the paper about the issue that we're listening to. Extremely relevant. Good of you. There are stickers. For those of you that have perfect attendance, Will Schneider has a sticker for you on the way out. Make sure you pick them up. Next week, we are not meeting here. Next week, the meeting is Wednesday. It's evening at 5:30 at the Federal Reserve. It's going to be a great networking opportunity to talk about business to business and learning a little bit more about what Rotarians do with each other. So please make sure you're there. Bring a picture ID because it's the only way you can get in there is with a picture ID. You know, we ask if it's fair to all concerned in what we do. And water is something that's very difficult to come to fairness, and that's where the art of the compromise comes in. And we know that water is a precious, precious resource for us in Colorado. And no, it is not so you can water your tender little marijuana plants at home, but it is, of course, for the future of our state. So as you go out there, let's make sure that as we discuss water, that we try to remain as fair as we can to all concerned. Thank you very much. We stand adjourned.